All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's lecture. This lecture, we are going to be talking about adaptive management and sustainability planning in conservation and human wildlife conflict management. So, this is, a critical topic because the approaches that we're going to discuss today, they represent a fundamental shift in how many conservation practitioners and those who seek to address human wildlife conflict think about solutions, right? So we've talked a lot about moving away from top down, one size fits all solutions toward more collaborative, learning based approaches that are going to put communities at the center of decision making, which is crucial. So, by the end of today, I want you to have a good understanding, and also for your toolkit to understand why adaptive management is essential for human wildlife conflict solutions and management, and how to build community resilience, what that means, and how we can support communities in community based solutions and protecting their crops and livestock. And then we're going to talk at a high level about something called the open standards or the conservation standards for planning. And this is a good framework to help you plan and bring all these concepts and ideas together and to do it in a collaborative way with a team or a local community. It's a great tool that's widely used and would be important for you to take away as a practical thing for you to use in your career or for your toolkit. So, let's go back a little bit and remember the reality on the ground that human wildlife conflict it's not a static problem, right? We've gone over this extensively, right? A recent literature review by Abbas and colleagues, which was published in 2025, this year found that human wildlife conflict is increasing globally in both frequency and severity. Climate change is a major driver of this. The FAO reported, the Food and Agricultural Organization reported in 2023 that climate change is exacerbating conflicts through increased competition for water and habitats. Species are leaving protected areas more, seeking that high energy, high value crop. And in situations where droughts hit, wildlife and people they're being pushed in even closer proximity and competing for already scarce resources. And with natural disasters and the like, this is also increasing. So this creates another challenge of public health dimension that we can't ignore. The World Health Organization has noted that 75% of emerging pathogens and zoonotic diseases originate in animals, right? COVID-19, these devastating pandemics come from the interface between humans, domestic animals, and wildlife. It's a critical zone for disease emergence that has to be addressed. So this really emphasizes how we manage these interactions is consequential. It's very important and really importantly, traditional approaches to human wildlife conflict have often failed, and we'll talk about why in a moment. But really, the key takeaway is we need fundamentally different approaches if we're going to achieve sustainable coexistence between people and wildlife. So, what is adaptive management? At its core, this is about learning by doing. Really, that's what's at the core. It's a systematic approach to improving management by treating interventions as experiments, right? Using research thinking. You're going to design actions, programs, mitigation, interventions based on the best available information that you have and can find, but you're going to acknowledge that uncertainty is inevitable and that that's a reality up front. Okay. And so you implement the actions, you monitor what happens, and you learn from the results, and then you adjust your approach accordingly. This might sound really basic, right? It might sound just like trial and error, but it's a little bit more complex than that. It's structured intentional experimentation with clear hypotheses, and you really think about how systems work, and you use rigorous monitoring to test those hypotheses, right? So the key mindset shift is this: we need to stop pretending that we have all the answers, right? We need to embrace uncertainty more and build learning into our management processes. And you'd be surprised how many organizations, programs, projects don't do this, right? They just steam ahead and keep going with their original plan without that learning and adjustment. And so the adaptive management cycle has 5 phases that repeat continuously, right? This doesn't end. This is not a one-way street. So first, you're going to plan your interventions or conceptualize based on, again, your current understanding. And then you're going to implement those plans. And then you set up monitoring systems to determine what is actually happening. You analyze those results to understand what worked, what didn't, and why. And then you adapt your approach based on what you learned, right? This leads into the next planning cycle, the next iteration, the next phase of the project. It's circular. Again, it's not linear. You never really reach a final solution and stop point. The system keeps changing. The social ecological system where human wildlife conflict is taking place is changing. Animals are adapting, people are changing, the climate's changing. There might be something going on in the community that's changing. So management has to keep evolving. This continuous iteration is what really allows you to improve over time and respond to those changing conditions, right? It's the difference between like installing a fence that might work in this year but deteriorates and isn't supported and falls down the next, right? So traditional approaches such as that fence example I just gave you, they often fall short, right? So research by Logan and colleagues and other recent studies have pointed to several systemic issues. First, traditional approaches, they tend to focus primarily on wildlife conservation or the behavior of wildlife or ecology while neglecting community needs and perspectives. And we've discussed this. And this creates resentment. It undermines long term sustainability of any solution. Second, we've often applied one size fits all solutions without accounting for local context, right? What works for elephant conflict in one village, it might be completely ineffective in another village just a few kilometers away due to differences in land use, social structures, economic system, the ecosystem, the grade of the hillside, right? So many different things. And third, there's been a real lack of systematic and systemic monitoring, right? We might implement an intervention and declare success based on some early evidence, but we're not rigorously measuring outcomes over a long period of time, or with unified data collection tools that are getting us reliable information over that period of time. And without good data, and we can't learn what actually works, right? We're just kind of poking around in the dark. And fourth, there's limited learning between projects, which might surprise you, but it's absolutely true. Knowledge systems often stay siloed within individual organizations or projects rather than being shared broadly. There's a real lack of collective evidence base. Large NGOs often don't share a lot of their information with other NGOs. There's often like data rights policies and a lot of gatekeeping that goes on. And this again leads to more top-down implementation that's going to ignore local expertise and undermine community buy-in and violate the rights and needs of community members. And if you don't have that, any solution is inevitably not going to work. And this really brings us to community resilience. And this could be a lecture in itself. I'm going to go over this quite high level, but it's really fundamental to sustainable human wildlife conflict management. Resilience here means the capacity of communities to absorb shocks, adapt to change, and continue functioning in the face of conflict and challenges. There are 3 pillars you can think of. I mean, resilience has been defined in many different ways in many different contexts, but at a high level, we're thinking about adaptive capacity, again, which refers to the community's ability to adjust livelihoods, practices, and social systems in response to an external shock or changing conditions. Second, social cohesion means the strength of relationships and trust within communities. This is going to really enable collective action, working together, organizing to accomplish a goal or to make a change. And third, economic diversification is going to reduce dependence on any single livelihood that might be vulnerable to wildlife impacts, like growing a specific crop or only, raising cattle. And the critical point is really this, right? Communities must be partners in human wildlife conflict management. We've talked about this endlessly, right? They are not passive recipients of interventions designed elsewhere. Their knowledge, the local knowledge, and their priorities, their needs, what they want to accomplish, and their agency, their power to do that, it's central to any solution that's going to endure in the long term. And that's what we need. That's what we're aiming for over and all in a larger scope. And there's some practical building blocks of community resilience, and I'll kind of focus on the human wildlife conflict context and give an example. So, some research from Kenya, from Nature Kenya in 2024, and other organizations working on the ground highlighted some key elements in building resilience for human wildlife conflict. Having local monitoring systems that engage community members in tracking wildlife movements, collecting camera trap data, keeping track of crop damage, keeping track of communal funds. This really helps build that community agency, right? This creates the idea of early warning capacity, and it builds more ecological ownership and awareness in the community. Community led compensation schemes, these can be more responsive and context appropriate than government programs that are going to have a lot of red tape and might be complex. Focusing that in the community is important. A report from Schofield Associates in 2024, looking at this issue in Africa, found that local compensation systems were almost always faster and better tailored to community needs. Of course, right? It's local. They know what's going on. You don't have to travel long distances. There's not that bureaucracy of government. And again, this circles back to livelihood diversification being critical, right? If people are depending entirely on livestock or crops that are vulnerable to wildlife conflict and damage and destruction, they're extremely exposed. They're extremely vulnerable. So we have to think about alternative income sources that are going to reduce that vulnerability, create options, create alternatives. And this could include tourism. It could include beekeeping, other crops to grow, right? It could include many of these things, but it needs to be appropriate and desired for the community, right? It needs to be piloted. It needs to have social safeguarding. It can't just be kind of random, right? And we have to think about how could shape the social structure in the community, or could perhaps lead to negative outcomes that we didn't expect, like over tourism and things like that. And we should never overlook traditional ecological knowledge, right? Communities, they have the best understanding of wildlife behavior in their own landscape, and they will have the most important insight on the conflict dynamics and the longest knowledge over that temporal scale that if we're just entering the community, we could never have, right? Their knowledge should inform all management decisions and should be co-created. And finally, collective action capacity, which we already discussed, but this is again building organizational structures and trust that's going to allow community members to work together, to work with organizations, and to really be able to tackle complex problems effectively and weather some of the challenges, go through some of the long-term difficulties, and work as a team in that capacity. An example of what this looks like in practice is the African Wildlife Foundation Manyara Ranch. They successfully handed over conservation management to local communities in this space, and human wildlife conflict decreased by 20% over 5 years. And the report shows this wasn't because of like high tech interventions or massive outside investments. It was because the solutions were locally led. They were tailored to the specific context, and the community had genuine ownership and decision making power. This shifted the tolerance for the wildlife. It demonstrates that when we get government structures and community engagement right, in some cases, we can achieve these measurable improvements in coexistence, right? But again, it's an adaptive process. We have to make sure that this can change and be flexible and responsive to different realities. And so this brings us to the idea of open standards or conservation standards planning. So this is a structured framework for implementing adaptive management and the community engagement principles that we've discussed. The open standards were developed by the Conservation Measures Partnership, and it's a collaboration of major conservation organizations that includes WWF, the Nature Conservancy, USAID, Conservation International. And it's not an obscure, complex academic framework. It's kind of just like flow diagramming, like flow charting, right? It's used at over 1,500 sites globally. It's really accessible, and it's a great tool to use with community members and partners and staff members. Um, it's the closest thing that we really have to like a standard for conservation project management. So it's good because we can again standardize and systematize across spaces where knowledge and learning is often siloed. So this really helps us to all be on the same page. So there are five steps. Sometimes there's different iterations of this. I think the improved version has like about 6 steps, but that it's very similar to adaptive management. So it provides a lot of detailed guidance. Again, I could teach a whole course on this topic. I'll share some information and training with you. You can get certified in this at Colorado State University, or the Nature Conservancy headquarters, I believe, offer some trainings every now and again. But again, similarly to adaptive management, you're going to conceptualize, you're going to define the project scope, build your understanding of the system, the ecosystem, the social system you're working in. And then you're going to plan, you're going to develop the strategies and monitoring approach that you're going to use. And again, you want these to be smart, specific, measurable, accurate, realistic, time bound, achievable or accurate, whatever. You want them to be smart, and you want to, develop this monitoring system and understand the metrics that you're going to work with early on. And then again, very similar to adaptive management, right? You're going to, implement, take action, and you're going to collect data along the way. You're going to have those data protocols ready before you implement. And that's going to allow you to then analyze and adapt, where you're going to see what's working, what's not, and be able to adjust course and change. And then again, this is critical. You're going to share. You're going to share where you document and disseminate what you've learned, to contribute to the broader knowledge base. That's a key component of the conservation standards, is you can access other data. You can see what other groups have done, right? And sequential phases that you're going to do in the future with this process creates that double loop of learning, right? You're going to cycle through, continuously refining your understanding and your approach, and others can learn from you and you can learn from others. It's quite innovative and really important, and I'm glad to see that it's expanding more and more, and we have more and more trainings available for students, practitioners, and local community members around the globe. And then, with the integration phase, this is where you can think about how these fit together when you are going to think about adaptive management principles and community resilience into this like planning stage you've done, right? This is going to, give you a really robust approach to your management. And it's rigorous and flexible as well. So the open standards give you structure and discipline, right? So in each step, like step 1 and 2, you are going to define your conservation targets. This is not just going to be about wildlife species. It's going to be about human communities and the ecosystems and the ecosystem services they depend on. And you need to really think about the full social ecological system. You're going to map out, with the open standards planning, in that diagramming, the threats and the stakeholders. Who are all the actors involved? What are their interests? What are the sources of pressure on both the wildlife and the community well-being? You're going to build situation models. These are sometimes called conceptual models. They're going to show how different factors are connected, how they're reacting and networking with each other. And this really helps you visualize a complex system, right? And think in the system. Think about different outcomes rather than just focusing on individual symptoms and in like one lane thinking. And in the planning phase, you're going to develop results chains. These are logic models that are going to spell out the theory of change that you developed, right? So if we do intervention X, we expect Y to change, which will lead to outcome Z. Making these assumptions explicit means you can test them, right? You can select indicators that you want to measure and monitor that will tell you whether your strategies are working. And you can really see that quite clearly, right? In big projects, this is incredibly important. And then the monitoring plan, again, that will specify exactly what data you'll collect, how, when, and by whom, to really make it systematic. In step 3 and 4, this is the implementation phase. This is where you execute your strategies, but you're doing so in a disciplined way. You're collecting that monitoring data systematically, right? Not just randomly. You're documenting your activities so there's a clear record of what you've actually done that you can show to folks, go back to look on, share with community members. And in the analysis and adaptation phase, right, you're going to bring the data together and evaluate that effectiveness. Are you making progress towards the targets that you set at the beginning, right? Are your strategies working as expected? Are the underlying assumptions in your results chain holding up? And based on this analysis, you're going to adjust your strategies. Maybe you double down on what's working. Maybe you abandon what's not. Maybe you realize that your initial situation model was incomplete and you need to add new elements. You've learned new things. The point is that that decision about how to adapt, it's driven by evidence, not just intuition or politics or donor funds. This is where adaptive management becomes real, right? You're not just implementing a fixed plan, you're actively learning and evolving your approach based on what the data is telling you. The learning, again, is often very neglected, but it's critical. The open standards really emphasize that you should document both your successes and failures. And unfortunately, we tend to only publish and talk about what worked, right? Negative results are information too. It's important. They tell other folks and practitioners and groups what not to waste their time on. You can communicate your findings to all your stakeholders in this way. You need to. And that includes the community members you're working with, funders, conservation practitioners, and the broader scientific community. But by contributing to that global knowledge base, you are enabled that double loop learning. This is learning that's going to inform not just your next iteration of your own project, but the entire field's understanding of what is actually working, right? And so the Conservation Measures Partnership maintains, again, as I mentioned, this database and learning platform that you can access that across many different projects and geographies. So you can see when you combine this with some of the other ideas we talked about, this really builds a robust system, and it gives you the opportunities to really bolster community resilience, to build local capacity and agency, and um, community engagement. Again, without this, systematic monitoring and learning, it can really perpetuate ineffective approaches. And adaptive management without a structured framework can just really become not adaptive, ad hoc, and reactive. So, um, using this approach, you have higher chances of generating sustainable, equitable solutions. And technology is increasingly part of this picture. So, GPS tracking, geofencing, camera traps, acoustic monitoring, these can all help you with the sophisticated ecological data collection, early warning systems, monitoring, but also community based data collection, community based enumeration, participatory workshops. All of this can help in their own ways. And it should be, a very diverse interdisciplinary toolkit. Community monitoring apps where people can like report conflict on their cell phone and report real-time early warning systems can really build again resilience and community capacity. But technology is a tool, right? It's not a solution. AI potentially contributing to the militarization of conservation is a serious concern. Privacy violations from like constant monitoring through cameras and conservation continuing to exacerbate inequalities. We have to really be careful about this. Again, technology should augment, not replace community knowledge and participation. And I add Marathi here because Marathi is a software tool you can use online to create those conceptual models for open standards. So definitely explore that if you have some time. So, kind of circling back, what makes approaches succeed? Well, based on our findings and based on data, several factors are critical. First, again, genuine community participation, not just consultation. Communities need decision-making power, ownership. You need to have a long-term commitment. Adaptive management requires time. You need multiple cycles to learn and adapt, right? Short project timelines will undermine this. You can't do it. Flexible funding is really important, and it's hard to find, but you need funding that's going to allow you to adjust strategies to fail in some cases based on what you learn rather than being locked into predetermined work plans. This is not the norm in the funding landscape. And, as future folks in this space, we should push more for that, right? We should push more for conservation that is going to show responsible planning and funders who are open to longer timelines and open to this adaptive cycle of learning changing. If we do it responsibly, we can do no harm, right? We can set up do no harm policies if we do it responsibly and have social safeguards in place. And again, failing and accepting that some strategies won't work, treating those as learning opportunities rather than a catastrophic failure that is devastating. And again, going back to monitoring, we discussed that pretty in depth. Some pitfalls that I would encourage you to avoid, especially when you're developing this section of your toolkit, but also in your real life. But one major problem is measuring success only by dollars spent and projects completed or dollars returned, right? Rather than looking at the outcomes on the ground. Did conflict actually decrease? Like, how are we measuring that? Are livelihoods more secure? Are we talking to community members? Are we collecting data on diverse social ecological outcomes? That's really important. These questions really matter, right? Ignoring local context is going to lead to more cookie cutter solutions that don't fit, that don't work. Because like I said, what works for one community might not work for their neighbors. Short term project cycles are really endemic in conservation funding, like I mentioned, but they're really fundamentally at odds with adaptive management. It requires sustained engagement. So we have to, again, push for change in that space. You have to document things systematically, right? We have to keep, reinventing the wheel and repeating mistakes others have already made, right? If we're not doing that, we have to share the systematic documentation. We need to, use tools like the open standards that are going to put us in similar spaces to be able to compare similar data. And again, top-down decision making, that's going to undermine everything, the community ownership and the social capital. There are some cases where it's appropriate, but if we're doing community-based conservation, especially with human wildlife conflicts, a top-down, dictating style of conservation management just doesn't hold up. We've found over time. Excuse me. So, what does this mean for you, right? So, in your toolkit, in your future, I want you to use mindsets and skills that are going to embrace uncertainty, right? The systems that we're working in, are complex and dynamic. You're never going to have perfect information, and that's okay. Good adaptive management is about making the best decisions you can with available information. Be honest about it. Be honest about uncertainty and be committed to continually learning. Be humble. Don't try and think that you need to be an expert or perfect in all spaces. And again, this seems obvious, but listen to communities. The people living with wildlife every day, they have the best knowledge and their priorities. They must shape interventions, right? It shouldn't just be up to what you think is going to work or what's going to fit the grant call. Use evidence, not assumptions, right? Invest in good monitoring and be willing to change course when the data tells you something isn't working. Again, failed data, bad data is not something we want to throw away. Share what you learned. Again, the good and the bad. Contribute to collective knowledge and help others learn from your experience so they don't repeat the same mistakes. Conservation funding is finite. We don't need people making the same mistakes we already made, right? We're all working towards the same cause. And finally, again, think in systems. I really encourage you to think in systems. There's a great book by Donella Meadows called Thinking in Systems. Once you start thinking in systems, you never can see the world the same again. But I think systems thinking is so critical to tackling some of the most complex, wicked problems like climate change that we face today and human wildlife conflicts, right? Human wildlife conflict is never just a wildlife management problem or a human development problem or a farming problem. It's a social ecological systems challenge that is unique and dynamic. And it really requires that integrated thinking and mapping whenever we enter a new space. So, again, remember that this work, it's science and practice. It requires technical rigor and like we mentioned, systematic thinking, but it also requires humility, cultural competence, relationship building, and the ability to work across different knowledge systems and worldviews. So I encourage you to think about that if you want to enter this field and think about how you can develop those skills. The most effective conservation practitioners that I know are those who can, hold complexity, embrace learning, genuinely partner with communities and maintaining scientific rigor while also being flexible and, showing humility when they're wrong. I mean, that's what we need more of in this field. So thanks for your attention today. I'm going to have a lot of resources in this module that I encourage you to explore. Yeah, we'll talk soon. Good luck ahead.